Hi, it's Emma from Arise, and I want to just introduce to you the Great Expectations class that we'll be doing after the summer holidays. So I just want to do a short mini lesson looking at how to analyse a character from a short excerpt of the novel, and just discuss how, so that would be a little view of how a class would look. But obviously within the class there'll be group interaction and discussion about what we're looking at. So we're going to be doing Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. It is quite a meaty book, but not as much as a lot of other Dickens novels. We are using this edition by Oxford University Press, and there's a link in that in the class description for kids to buy, for families to buy this edition, and that's just so that when I'm referencing page numbers, we're all on the same page, literally on the same page. The other thing that's good about this book is at the end there are comprehensive notes. So throughout the novel there'll be little asterisks on different words or phrases. Some of them words like maybe they're Victorian slang words, for example, or aspects of Victorian society and the culture that we just have got no familiarity with today, and so those asterisks take to the notes and explain these ideas, concepts, words, it might be a political reference, whatever it is. So it really helps your understanding, and so that makes this a really great book to have, and there's appendices as well. So this is a book to purchase. Also, if you buy the workbook but you don't buy the class, again, if in the workbook pages reference will be from this edition, but obviously that's not as, the chapter will also be referenced, so it's not as important. Okay, so we're going to look at the character of Mrs. Joe in this lesson, and so it's a little excerpt from chapter 2, and we've been introduced to Pip. Pip is the main character. The novel is told in the first person from Pip's perspective, and it starts off as Pip is a little boy and he is being raised by his sister Mrs. Joe. We only know her ever by the name Mrs. Joe, and she's quite a bit older than him, and she's married to Joe, the village blacksmith. And in chapter 2 we first meet Mrs. Joe and Joe. So this is where, let me just pull up the relevant excerpt. So this here is what we're going to be looking at. I'm just going to read it to you. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbours because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what this expression meant, and knowing her to have had hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Joe Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and had a general impression that she must have made Joe Gargery marry her by hand. Joe was a fair man, with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with his own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was a tall, bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops, and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made a powerful merit in herself and a strong reproach against Joe that she wore the apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it at all, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. So this is it. This is how chapter 2 essentially opens, and we've just Pip has just come home, and he's introducing us to his sister and to Joe Gargany, who he lives with. Um, so we see in this actual physical description of Mrs. Joe. And so we're going to look at that. So we see that she's older than Pip. She's 20 years older than him. And we see here that she's not good looking. She has black hair and eyes and a prevailing redness of skin. So we have this physical idea of her as not a very attractive woman. There is a coarseness in her looks, and if we compare her appearance to Joe, there's quite a strong juxtaposition in the two characters. Now, there's some expressions here we really need to understand the meaning of. The first one is brought me up by hand. So let's just highlight this in a different colour. So what this here means by hand, this is an expression which was used if a baby had been orphaned. So Pip, we find out both his parents have died when he was an infant. So he was left under the care of his sister. And in those days, if a baby has no parents, they have to be fed. They have to feed. You would give them milk to drink from a little cup, or they would sometimes dip it in a rag and they would suck the rag. And it would be cow's milk. If there wasn't a wet nurse, this would be how you'd have to try and feed this baby. And then in the Victorian time and Georgian time before that, most of these babies actually died. It was very unusual to successfully be able to feed an infant if you were not actually breastfeeding that baby. And so this fact that she has this great reputation with herself and neighbours shows that well, she was able to do it. Pip survived, and he's now a little boy. He's now a boy, and so she makes quite a lot of this. That you've been brought up by hand, and this keeps getting cast up to Pip throughout the opening chapters of the novel, that he was brought up by hand, and almost like he should. It's almost an accusation really towards him that he's been this great burden to his sister, and it was all his fault, and it's cast up to him again and again and again, and Mrs. Joe makes a big deal basically the fact that she was able to do this, that she brought him up by hand. But as we see here, Pip doesn't understand the meaning of this expression, so he hears this every day of his house. I brought you up by hand. And he thinks it's something to do with the treatment as a boy he is experiencing from Mrs. Joe. And not only himself, but also Joe, the husband. Because we see here that she had a hard and heavy hand, and she had the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as me. So we see here that Mrs. Joe's actually a very violent woman. Joe, in today's language, is a victim of domestic abuse. She's a very unpleasant character, is Mrs. Joe. She's got a fiery temper, and when she loses her temper, she goes into these violent rages, and she attacks her husband. In a short while after this passage, we find out she's got something called the tickler, which is a bit of an oxymoron because it sounds like, oh, it's a nice little tickle, but no, she beats her husband, and she beats Pip with the tickler. But so we see this is in Pip's little boy mind, this expression brought by hand, he confuses it with the violence that he experiences at his sister's hand, and the violence that he sees Joe experiencing by his sister's hand, and so he thinks it's something to do with that, and she thinks that Joe gets treated like a little boy, gets treated exactly the same way as Pip. So if we contrast this, so we've got this again, this whole idea of must have made Joe Gargany marry her by hand. So Pip gives us this picture of almost like this man being dragged to the church and being forced to marry, that she forces Joe to marry her by hand. Because to Pip, there's this inexplicable disconnect between the way his sister is and the man that Joe is. You can't understand why on earth would Joe have married this woman, because she's an absolute tyrant. She's not attractive. She treats him appallingly well, appallingly badly. And so the only explanation was that poor Joe was dragged to the church and forced to marry her, which isn't quite true, but we'll be looking at that in another lesson when we look more closely at Joe Gargery as a man. In this excerpt is mostly dealing with Mrs. Joe, but Dickens uses the juxtaposition. So this is when you take two things, in this example, two people who are opposite and compare them side by side for effect. So in all that Mrs. Joe is the complete opposite. So their hair colour is complete opposites. Joe's is fair, Mrs. Joe's black. Joe has these pale blue eyes, Mrs. Joe's are black. Joe has fair, smooth skin, and Mrs. Joe's is described as a prevailing redness of skin. And he goes on to say that, if possible, she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. So he's describing the colour, but also this idea of a nutmeg grater being used on the skin also gives this idea of coarseness. So he's not saying her skin is coarse, but the way he describes her in the skin gives us an impression that her skin probably would feel coarse if we touched it. So for those who don't know, a nutmeg, when you buy a nutmeg, it's like a little round ball, about that size, a bit smaller actually, and it's hard, and so you could buy a nutmeg grater, which is like a tiny little cheese grater with smaller holes, and it's rough, and you would grate the nutmeg, and to use it in cooking. And so he's seeing our skin, and he thinks this nutmeg grater rubbed on her skin, so it's red. You'd think it seems quite coarse. He even describes her apron as coarse. So there's this overarching picture of a very coarse, hard woman. She's tall and bony, whereas we get an impression of Joe as being big and kind of strong, but not so much bony, muscular. Joe's also described as being mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easygoing, all these positive attributes that Mrs. Joe is completely devoid of. We see also this juxtaposition with Mrs. Joe's a violent woman, but Joe is a man who is very strong. He's described as having Hercules' strength. So Hercules is a character in Greek mythology who was famous for being very, very strong. But he had a weakness, and his weakness was he wasn't very intelligent. So Joe's physically very strong. He could completely take hold of his wife and make her subject to him, force her into submission if he wanted. He could stop her being violent. He's not that he's physically unable to do so, he chooses not to do it. And that's really important to understand. Joe as a character, he does not force his wife into subjugation to him, even though he is completely capable. He's a very, very strong man. His weakness is he's not very intelligent, and this is something that keeps coming back in the book with Joe. Mrs. Joe is painted as somebody who she's more intelligent, but in a way she's more foolish. So we see Joe later as being, he'll say things that are very wise and very profound, because he doesn't speak intelligently, and he's big and he's cumbersome. Nobody thinks of him as being an intelligent man, whereas Mrs. Joe, she is intelligent, but she's a foolish woman. So it's important to see this juxtaposition between the two characters. If you look down here, we have more of this kind of physical description of Mrs. Joe. We talked about the prevailing red skin, this idea of the soap and the nutmeg grater on her skin, and then we get to this description of her coarse apron. and how on it's got this square impregnable bib in front, stuck full of pins and needles. So throughout Great Expectations, different characters will often have different physical things which are a reflection of something deep within their characters. We see that time and time again when we come to talk about Mr. Jaggers. His soap is something that is deeply connected with him as a character and is a reflection of part of who he is. With Mrs. Joe, it's this apron full of pins and needles, and it really just underlines and enhances this idea of her being somebody who is not approachable, she's not warm, she's not affectionate. Pip goes on to say it's a strong reproach against Joe that she wore it so much, that you can imagine this man, he isn't going to come to his wife to give him a cuddle. He's not going to show, there's this lack of marital affection between them, and it's because of Mrs. Joe. We've just been told what a sweet, easygoing man Joe is, and he defends his wife time and time again. Even though she has nothing that she deserves at all. There's no redeeming features in this woman. And so this apron, this impregnable apron, is keeping her husband at bay. There's this picture of no intimacy, no affection between them because of the way she is. She's repelling him. And the words that we have here, let's look at the words to describe this apron. We've got impregnable, a strong reproach. So that's almost like to give her out to somebody, to reject them, as an insult against them, a criticism against them. This idea of something being impregnable is like a fortress that you can't get past. And again, we see how Pip really doesn't understand why Mrs. Joe is like this, that she always wears it, this is always the way she is. There's no kind of moment where she lets her guard down and she's kind and warm and loving and affectionate. She just isn't that kind of person. So we have this opening scene. The rest of chapter 2 really opens up this domestic picture of life for Pip and Joe under the tyranny of Mrs. Joe. Yeah, so it's important when we're analysing a character, we're looking at the kind of the face value description, like she's 20 years older. We've got that she's got black hair and eyes, but when looking at these characters, look at the objects associated with them, look at how they're juxtaposed against something else. Look at any other images or allusions that we have to that character. For example, this repeating of being the by hand, this picture of she's using her hand, this violence that she has, and this whole idea of this coarseness, which is alluded to with the nutmeg grater. We talk about the coarse apron and the pins and needles on the apron as well. These all give this picture. They're pointing to the woman that she is, the character that she is. And when you're doing any analysing of any of the characters, look for these finer details. Look at the word choice that Dickens uses, like impregnable, strong reproach. Why has he picked those words? What do they show us about these characters? And how is he using the words in the description? Because that all gives us these insights into the kind of character Mrs. Joe is. So if you were to ask, if somebody asked you, what kind of character is Mrs. Joe? You could say something like, Mrs. Joe is a coarse woman. She is violent. She is unapproachable, with very little warmth in her character and her relationships with those closest to her. And when you're answering these kind of questions, always point back to the evidence in the text. Talk about the word choice that Dickens uses, talk about symbolism or literary devices that he uses, because it's all in there for effect to help you understand the character in which you're describing.